The world assumes libraries are safe, quiet places, rows of timber and candlelight. The hush of pages turned respectfully, the slow accretion of knowledge like snow settling on a windowpane. But what if one library once swallowed more than pages? What if it swallowed entire worlds of thought, vanished ships of language, and left behind nothing but rumor and the ghost of a map? Imagine a harbor city where scholars argued in boats, where ships arrived bearing papyrus like cargo and left with ideas strapped to their decks. Picture a place so magnetically curious that rulers would build temples to scholarship, and thought would be policed as carefully as grain. That is not a metaphor. That is Alexandria at its apogee, the place that taught the world how to measure the stars and catalog the words of Homer, and the place whose greatest collections slipped away and became a riddle that still nags at us. In these pages we will walk that foggy line between recorded history and myth, and promise you not tidy answers but larger, stranger questions, questions that will make you reconsider what lost actually means. We will meet keepers who may have been heroes or villains, scrolls that might have contained cures or curses, docks lined with traders from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, and scholars who catalogued the cosmos with the same care they catalogued a single lily. We will not simply retell familiar legends of burning and conquest. We will pry open the assumptions, examine the evidence from 1,000 angles, and let competing theories spar until the light from them reveals something none can quite claim. I will speak plainly to you, because this story lives best in the ear, and I will keep a steady, curious skepticism. It is one thing to believe in wonder, and another to mistake fantasy for fact. We will step into foggy mornings at the edge of the Mediterranean and into late-night debate halls warmed by oil. We will be both forensic and poetic, precise about dates and generous with the imagination, because to understand the mystery we must be willing to hold both kinds of attention at once. We will trace trade routes measured in amphorae and star charts, and we will ask why some things survive in fragments and others in tidy invisibility. We promise large revelations of context, the library's place in a globalizing world, the political calculus that surrounded its keepers, the technologies of writing that once made knowledge fragile and luminous. But we'll also promise you the stubborn ache of not knowing, because some corners of history are not holes to be filled. They are snares that remind us how little authority we have over the past's last word. Keep walking with me. There are hearts to stand by, scrolls to imagine in your hands, and questions that will be with you long after the last sentence fades. When you think of the Library of Alexandria, you probably picture a conflagration, a single dramatic night when flame ate the city and fire ate the books. But a sharper, stranger image emerges when you look at the world around that myth. Ports bristling with ropes, scholars arguing by the quay, and cartographers trying to pin the world to parchment. The story of the lost library is not only a story of loss, it is a story of preservation, of deliberate collection strategies that reached into bazaars and into the hands of sailors. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which began to rule Egypt after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, saw knowledge as both prestige and policy. Ptolemy I and his successors cultivated an environment where the crown invested in scholars, funded expeditions, and tried to assemble the world's books under one roof. Ships arriving at Alexandria's docks were said to have their cargoes searched. Copies of texts might be copied by royal scribes and kept, while the originals were allowed to continue their voyage. Whether that policy is exaggerated or not, the mechanism itself explains how the library could grow to an almost unthinkable size in a relatively short span, through the city's place at the crossroads of Mediterranean, Black Sea, and Red Sea trade, and through the political will to make Alexandria a hub for knowledge. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The evidence for the library's size and exact nature is mixed at best. Ancient sources talk about hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Modern historians argue over what precisely those numbers mean. Were these scrolls individual works, or bundles? How many copies of each text were stored? And what exactly did library mean to Hellenistic rulers who blurred the line between archive, research institution, and cultural showpiece? Our archaeological record is frustratingly thin. Alexandria was a living, changing city built on layers and layers of silt, and the sea has moved over and into significant portions of what used to be shoreline. Some fragments and inscriptions survive. Many of the largest buildings left little trace above ground. Still, for all the holes in the material record, the intellectual footprint is enormous. The library's scholars produced the work of a civilization rethinking its own heritage. Callimachus compiling an institutional catalogue that read like a taxonomy of the literary world, Eratosthenes measuring the Earth's circumference with astonishing precision in the 3rd century BC, and countless grammarians and commentators whose efforts shaped how texts were transmitted for centuries. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn. Merchants are loading amphorae onto camels bound for the western desert. A scholar argues in quick Greek about whether a line in Homer is original or interpolated, and at the edge of the harbor a scribe sets down a fresh copy of a play. That scene, mixing the ordinary with the extraordinary, is the world that the library belonged to. There are multiple competing theories about the library's ultimate fate, each of them plausible in its own register, and each of them raising questions that still resist closure. One long-standing narrative says the library was destroyed during Julius Caesar's involvement in Alexandria in 48 BC. His forces allegedly set fire to the fleet in the harbor, and the conflagration spread to warehouses and, in some accounts, to the library. But if Caesar's fire consumed the library, why do records show significant library activity after that date? Scholars have offered a more nuanced view. Perhaps parts of the collection, particularly those stored in annexes or dependent institutions, survived, and the center of intellectual activity simply shifted. Another line of argument suggests that the library declined gradually. Economic strains, shifts in political patronage, and changing scholarly fashions may have eroded its infrastructure and funding. Still, for all the evidence of decline, some texts credited to Alexandrian scholarship continued to exist centuries later, complicating any single catastrophic model. There is an intoxicating mythic element that popular retellings always add: cursed scrolls, secret vaults under temple stones, librarians who swore oaths and were buried with books, and a final inventory listing the names of works so dangerous they could unmake kings. These images are compelling because they suggest the library held not only literature and science but also forbidden knowledge, maps of pre-flood continents, pharmacopoeia of insanities, or astronomical secrets that could bend time. Now, let's be fair, the more extravagant claims often lack archival support, and they sit uneasily with the dry accounts of royal expenditure and administrative records. Still, the myth is meaningful, because it reveals how later generations projected their hopes and fears onto a lost repository. Imagine a vast vault, oil lamps guttering, dust motes like galaxies under a high dome. Picture yourself standing inside and running a hand across a spine of rolled papyrus. Smell the mold and salt, hear the creak of a ladder, and feel a chill that is part awe, part dread. That sensory imagining is not evidence, but it is a necessary step. It situates us emotionally inside the mystery, and helps explain why the library's loss feels like the loss of a cultural limb. The scale and scope of the library's collecting strategies also open other, stranger puzzles. For example, how did the Ptolemaic administration manage cataloging across languages: Greek, Egyptian Demotic, Hebrew, Phoenician, and languages of the Nubian and Indian traders? Callimachus' Pinox, a pioneering bibliographic work, hints at such cross-linguistic ambition, but fragments and references leave much to conjecture. Then there is the technological constraint. Papyrus is fragile, vulnerable to humidity, insects, and the salt air of a bustling port. How did the library's conservators try to preserve texts? Were there specialized rooms with airflow and particular shelving methods? Our clues are mostly literary, and they sometimes mix practical detail with the rhetorical flourish of ancient authors. Still, these small hints, references to catalogs, to community of scholars, to royal scribes, suggest an institutional sophistication that deserves the awe historians give it. But here's where it gets tricky again: our modern archival categories. Library, archive, research institute are not perfect fits for ancient institutions. The Library of Alexandria likely combined all those functions, and that hybridity may be the reason it both excelled and became so vulnerable. Competing hypotheses about the library's disappearance intersect with the politics of the ancient Mediterranean. Consider the idea that later Roman or Christian authorities deliberately targeted pagan centers of learning because their intellectual traditions posed a threat. The destruction of the Serapeum, the temple complex associated with the library, in 391 CE by a Christian mob under Theophilus is a historical event with clear evidence, and it likely damaged structures and collections. But we must be careful not to draw a direct, single-line causal chain from that violence to the end of all Alexandrian scholarship. The city was already centuries old by that time, and its institutions had been through decades of transformations. Still, the image of bonfires in temple courts is a powerful one, and it speaks to the cultural convulsions that accompanied the late antique period. Now, let's be fair, archival loss can also happen through slow neglect, shelves left to rot, scribes no longer paid, languages falling out of favor so that texts are simply unread. The slow death of an institution is quieter and perhaps even more tragic, because it leaves no single villain to blame. Amid these sober examinations, the mythic stories insist on amplifying the stakes. They tell of librarians who hid secret codices in the desert, of papyri shipped east to private collections in Petra or to the great libraries of Byzantium, of entire archives tucked into amphorae and sunk to the sea for safekeeping. Some recent finds, like fragments of Hellenistic poetry in unexpected places, or palimpsests recovered from later manuscripts, hint that not everything was irretrievably lost. Still, the fragments tease like constellations, connect a few dots and a pattern emerges, but vast spaces remain dark and obstinately uncatalogued. Picture yourself walking that foggy trail at dawn again, but now imagine that a small, salt-worn roll of papyrus slips from a merchant's pack and unrolls to reveal a line of verse never before known. The breathless thrill of discovery is the same today as it was for those ancient scholars. We still don't know precisely how the Library of Alexandria ended, and that persistent ignorance is not a failure of scholarship so much as a reflection of the library's complexity and the strangeness of time. We know fragments, hints, and fiery anecdotes. We know the names of a few scholars and the titles of some works, but the totality, the sense of a single, continuous place where knowledge of a whole world pooled and then evaporated, remains partly an invention, partly a truth. Yet that unresolved space is not empty. It is fertile, full of imaginative work, of new questions that force us to think about what it means to collect and conserve. It asks us not merely to mourn what is lost but to consider the values that created the library in the first place: curiosity, ambition, and an audacious belief that human thought could and should be gathered in one place. If you close your eyes now and picture those lamplit vaults, ask yourself what you would place on a shelf meant to represent your era. The lost library is not only a relic of the past, it is a mirror. There is one more curious layer we must consider, one that blends the empirical and the mythic so tightly that scholars frequently trip over it: the role of secrecy and censorship. We know that rulers sometimes suppressed texts for political reasons. Censorship was not unknown in antiquity. The Ptolemies may have sought to control certain works because they challenged royal legitimacy, or because their claims would disrupt trade advantages. Conversely, powerful texts could be hoarded because they conferred political capital, the capacity to command stories, to claim an intellectual lineage. This interplay between power and information management is central to understanding why knowledge might be centralized in a single institution, and why it might later be dispersed or destroyed. Imagine an official reading a new treatise on governance, and recognizing in its sentences a threat to the status quo. Such a reaction could lead to selective preservation, to copying only safe parts and burying or erasing the rest. That practice would leave a trace in the historical record: gaps, abrupt shifts in intellectual focus, and a cataloging record that looks suspiciously tidy in some places and dangerously patchy in others. Still, for all the intrigue, much of this remains speculative. We can see patterns and possibilities, but we cannot unroll the missing scrolls and read the sentences that might settle the question. So we approach the Library of Alexandria as both historical actor and mythic touchstone. We observe the physical constraints, the sea, the humidity, the perishable materials, and we observe the political pressures, patronage, languages in flux, and the shifting demands of rulers. Yet we also listen to the myths, the secret codices, the curses, the last night of the library stories, because myths tell us what later people feared losing and what they wished to protect. In this way, the library becomes less a single place and more a symbol. It stands for the fragile edge between preservation and oblivion, for the way a society makes choices about what to keep and what to forget. When we say we lost the Library of Alexandria, perhaps what we mean is that we lost a particular habit of care, a public commitment to gather, catalog, and make accessible vast networks of thought. That is an idea worth holding on to, even as specific facts about the library remain maddeningly out of reach. Keep that image in your mind as we move deeper into other mysteries. The loss of knowledge is rarely clean, rarely singular, and always entangled with power, economy, and the stubborn, unpredictable currents of human behavior. The Serapeum once stood like a promised antidote to the sea, an outbuilding of marble and shadow that suggested a city's attempt to anchor eternity in stone. Its story is threaded with the same stubborn enigma as the library itself. The Serapeum, a temple and later a scholarly annex dedicated to the syncretic god Serapis, became in the Hellenistic and Roman periods a repository for texts and treasures that some ancient voices called the daughter library. But was it really a second library, or a storehouse, or a political symbol that later generations retrofitted with scholarly meaning? To reconstruct its life, we begin with hard coordinates. The city of Alexandria was founded in 331 BC by Alexander the Great. The Ptolemaic dynasty reigned from 305 to 30 BC, and by the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, Alexandria had become a Mediterranean node where grain, papyrus, glass, and ideas threaded between west and east. The Serapeum itself rose near the royal quarter and the harbor, an architectural complex whose remaining traces in later sources suggest colonnades, a vast courtyard, and statuary that announced a blending of Egyptian and Hellenic religious life. Serapis himself was a deliberate fusion, a god meant to bridge populations. We have, relatively speaking, a clearer documentary pulse here than for other vanished spaces. Christian writers in the late 4th century described the Serapeum's destruction in 391 C under Theophilus, which involved a Christian assault on a temple precinct that had long been a symbol of pagan intellectual life. But the archaeologists looking for tidy answers find only stratified ruins and an archaeology complicated by centuries of occupation, rebuilding, and the city's famous tendency to swallow its own past beneath layers of reuse and silt. Still, let's be fair, ancient testimony, while valuable, is slanted. The accounts of the Serapeum's fall come to us from church historians who had motive to cast the episode as righteous cleansing, and from pagan writers who had motive to depict a cultural catastrophe. Between those pamphlets, and the dry numbers of pottery sherds and foundation stones, we are left with a puzzle that refuses classification. Did the Serapeum house long shelves of scrolls waiting to be rescued, or did it serve as a ceremonial depository where politically sensitive works were symbolically placed, but rarely used? Some modern scholars posit that the Serapeum was indeed the repository for a secondary collection, works that, after Caesar's alleged burning of ships in the harbor in 48 BC, were transferred from damaged storage to a more secure temple precinct. This scenario is tempting because it explains how literary activity could continue in Alexandria for centuries after the more famous conflagration. It also accords with Hellenistic patterns elsewhere, where temples often played the dual role of sanctuary and archive. On the other hand, other archaeologists caution that narrative economy should not override the vagaries of the material record. The scale of text-keeping implied by the daughter library model is extraordinary, and physical evidence tying vast numbers of rolls directly to the Serapeum is thin. But here's where it gets tricky. The Serapeum's destruction, as described by Ammianus Marcellinus and others, reads like an iconoclastic climax. Temples ransacked, statues toppled, and a final conflagration. That image fits a mythic script, but the stratigraphy says the story may be messier. Some deposits in the area show layers of burning interspersed with rebuilding, suggesting episodic violence rather than a single, clean annihilation. Moreover, the transition from pagan temple to Christian appropriation involved bureaucratic processes as well as street violence, imperial edicts, local councils, and a shifting economy that could have redirected resources away from large-scale book conservation. What could look like wholesale destruction might, in practice, be a long die-off, priests without patronage, scribes unpaid, scrolls lent out and never returned, bindings rotting in damp corners. And for all the dramatic rhetoric of books burned, we must recognize that actual biblioclasm often involves removal, reinterpretation, or repurposing of texts rather than literal combustion of every object. That muddiness is not a failure of imagination, it is an honest reflection of history's layeredness. There are also tantalizing data points. A handful of inscriptions, graffiti, and catalog fragments point to a living scholarly community associated with temple precincts. Roman-era letters mention exchanges of commentaries, and a papyrus here or there refers to priestly activities that intersected with scholarly life. Trade routes running into the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean delivered raw materials and ideas. Caravans from the desert delivered codices, and sailors from the Levant carried parchments of law and liturgy. Imagine a cool morning in the Serapeum courtyard. Priests in linen robes argue about ritual practice while a scholar leans on a column, reading a newly acquired fragment from the Western Aegean. In that daily calculus we see how religion and scholarship were braided together in ways that modern categories often obscure. And yet the mythic elements will not be kept silent. There are later traditions that whisper of secret vaults beneath the Serapeum, subterranean rooms where forbidden knowledge was tucked away, or where priceless scrolls were sealed in amphorae and buried or sunk in the sea to prevent confiscation. Some tell of a last-ditch effort. When the tide of Christianization became unstoppable, priests supposedly loaded precious rolls onto ships bound for distant courts and libraries. Carchemish, Antioch, even the courts of Persian rulers. Could an entire trunk of Alexandrian learning have been spirited away to the east, hidden in palaces or private holdings? There are threads that support this. Palimpsest discovered centuries later contained traces of texts whose style suggests Alexandrian provenance, and some Byzantine libraries catalog works with attributions to Alexandrian scholars. But the trail is skein-like and faint, fragments are hard to date precisely, and scribes copying texts centuries after the fact might be the only reason anything survived. Still, the possibility of escape is emotionally potent. Picture a boat leaving the Crescent harbor just before dawn, a roll of papyrus wrapped in oilskin resting on deck as lanterns wink and a wind from the south guides the hull eastward. That image answers a deep longing, the idea that knowledge, like human life, can be smuggled out of danger if someone is courageous enough to try. Now, let's be fair about the more sensational claims. Giant ossuaries found under temple floors, mummified sages, rituals so strange they hint at alchemical secrets. These are the sorts of things that circulate in pamphlets and late romances, and they often have no archaeological anchor. Yet their persistence reveals something essential. Later peoples projected their anxieties and fantasies onto the Serapeum, as if the temple were a stage where the future's nightmares and hopes could be acted out. To call it mere projection would be to ignore the cultural power of such imaginations. Myths about cursed scrolls or sealed vaults do cultural work. They dramatize the stakes of knowledge in a world where texts could alter reputations, justify empires, or delegitimize rulers. So even when sensational claims lack hard evidence, they illuminate the effective terrain surrounding the Serapeum's loss. Competing theories about what happened to the Serapeum converge on an uncomfortable core. Whether by fire, theft, neglect, or bureaucratic erasure, the results were curiously partial. Some texts, astronomical tables, commentaries on Homer, botanical treatises, survived in copies or excerpts circulated by pupils and rival schools. Others vanished without a trace, leaving only tantalizing references in later authors. That mixture, persistence amid attrition, complicates any single master narrative. It forces us to imagine history as a layered economy where value is redistributed. A commentary copied and stored in Constantinople may preserve a technical note from Alexandria, while a luxurious volume in Greek with diagrams may disappear entirely because the language falls out of institutional favor. Still, for all the evidence and speculation, there are moments when the Serapeum hums with human detail that resists tidy resolution. Consider the role of catalogs and the obvious work they imply. Callimachus Pinax, the great bibliographic catalog compiled at Alexandria, suggests an administrative sophistication that would have required trained clerks, inventories, and circulation policies. If the Serapeum functioned as an adjunct to such an apparatus, we should expect record-keeping, lists of loans, of damaged rolls, of authorship disputes. Yet we have almost none of those lists intact. The absence is telling. Records rot faster than marble. They are the first things cast aside when a city's priorities shift. Think of a clerk in the Serapeum making his tally in the dim light, fingers stained with ink, his back aching, counting scrolls and noting marginalia that testified to the life of reading. Those small acts of administration are what keep a library alive. When those acts cease, through whatever political or economic reasons, the institution's decay accelerates. We still don't know the Serapeum's full story, whether it was primarily temple, archive, or something in between, whether a single act destroyed it or whether time simply unspooled its activities into diaspora. The mystery persists because it sits at the intersection of religion and knowledge, of public spectacle and private labor. If you stand where the Serapeum once stood and listen, if you can imagine the clack of sandals on marble, the murmur of argument, the tearing of scroll wrappers, you will sense the awkwardly human heartbeat that underwrote that great and ambiguous complex. The openness of that question is a strange gift. It invites us to imagine the forms of care and the human choices that preserve a civilization's thinking, and it reminds us that the loss of a library is never merely the burning of objects, but the severing of habits that once sustained inquiry. The docks of Alexandria were not merely places to load grain and wine. They were the arteries through which ideas flowed, the marketplaces of language where a roll of papyrus could be worth as much as a crate of silver. Picture the harbor in the early Hellenistic centuries, long wooden jetties reaching into a green-blue sea, sails snapping like flags, sailors shouting in Egyptian, Greek, Phoenician, and Aramaic as they wrestled ropes. Here, traders from the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea met merchants from the western Mediterranean. Cedar timbers creaked beneath the weight of amphorae, and under them, in crates lined with straw, were bundles of scrolls. The Ptolemies understood this geography and bent law and bureaucracy around it. Ships arriving at Alexandria were sometimes inspected by royal agents. There are accounts, echoes in later authors, and the persuasive logic of archival policy that suggest a system. Texts could be copied by scribes attached to the crown, the copy retained in the royal collection, and the original returned or kept. That practice would have made Alexandria an enormous hub, not simply because the library acquired works, but because the city became a node in a vast copying machine that transformed local writings into materials that could circulate across empires. This was knowledge as logistics: ropes, pens, oil, and ink. Now, here's where it gets tricky. The exact mechanics of that system remain disputed. Some historians today imagine an almost cinematic procedure: ships berthed, clerks boarding, rolling aside bales to find scrolls, scholarly scribes rushing to copy while traders drank wine and argued politics. Others caution that such routine inspections would have been difficult to implement consistently. Ports are chaotic, inspectors can be bribed, and private rights over cargo complicated royal aspirations. Moreover, papyrus is fragile. The humid Mediterranean air, rats in the holds, and the constant jostle of travel could easily ruin a precious roll. So how did copyists achieve the quality necessary to preserve technical astronomical tables or precisions like Eratosthenes' measurements? Perhaps wealthy patrons funded special packing. Perhaps certain guilds specialized in treating texts for travel. Or perhaps only the most durable and portable items were selected for copying. Still, for all the practical difficulties, the archive system seems to have operated at least intermittently. And that intermittent operation explains why fragments of Alexandrian scholarship appear in surprising places centuries later. But let's be fair, maritime movement of texts also introduces a web of loss and theft. Ships sank, were attacked by pirates, or simply failed to arrive. Entire consignments of scrolls might have gone down in a storm, or been taken in a raid and scattered across the coasts. Some find the idea poetically dreadful. Whole libraries sliding under salt and time, their ink blotted by seawater, their knowledge dispersed into the deep. Yet the sea can also be a preserver. In anaerobic sediments, papyrus and leather can survive in unexpected states, which is why modern archaeologists sometimes recover texts from shipwrecks and salt-crusted harbors. The possibility that significant Alexandrian material rests beneath silt, rolled tight as a sleeping thing under the harbor's floor, is both thrilling and maddening, because the technical difficulties of underwater archaeology in a living urban port are enormous. Picture yourself leaning over a quay as a diver surfaces with a crate sealed in bitumen. The weight of the find is not merely physical but temporal. Here, for a breath, is a voice from a world that thought carefully about measurement, rhetoric, and the ordering of things. There is also a darker, more human strand, the idea that knowledge was smuggled for profit or for preservation. Traders and private collectors could hide a precious roll inside a hollow statue or under a false floorboard, or they might bribe a clerk to omit an item from inventory lists. Some traditions tell of entire trunks of books being spirited out of Alexandria under cover of night, bound for distant courts in Asia Minor or to the Persian sphere. Those narratives suggest an active diasporic flow rather than a single catastrophic event. And they are plausible. We have later catalogues in Constantinople and Constantinople's libraries that list works attributed to Alexandria, palimpsests, manuscripts where older writing was scraped and overwritten, yield faint traces of texts that stylistically match Alexandrian scholarship. These whispers across centuries suggest that what was lost in Alexandria may have lived on elsewhere, albeit in altered, fragmentary, and sometimes anonymous forms. Now, let's be fair about the romance of sunken vaults. Romantic accounts have long loved the image of submerged libraries, vaults sealed and sunk by priestly hands in a last attempt to protect knowledge from conquest. It makes for a story with theatrical closure, caretakers deep in the night bundling scrolls, the slow lowering of stone lids, the finality of salt-swallowing ink. Sensational as it is, actual evidence for deliberately submerged libraries is thin. Most likely, if such practices happened, they were ad hoc and localized rather than planned mass evacuations. Yet the myth persists because it encodes a moral. Knowledge is precious and its guardians will go to extraordinary lengths to preserve it. The myth's persistence also suggests a cultural logic that values the endurance of texts as a kind of immortality, and that sees the sea as both a threat and a grave. Competing theories about maritime loss also collide with the politics of sponsorship. If the crown actively sought to appropriate texts arriving at the harbor, then political shifts could alter the fate of those collections quickly. A successor king less interested in scholarly prestige might cut funding for scribes. A ruler facing military crisis might redirect funds to fortifications. A local tax revolt might disrupt the mechanisms of conservation. So the fate of texts was not only an issue of accidents at sea but of shifting fiscal and political priorities. Economics, in this sense, is destiny. A library needs funds as surely as it needs ink. The story of scrolls in transit is, therefore, also a story about the fragility of institutional commitment. Still, for all the logistical and political complications, the human dimension remains arresting. Imagine being a scribe on the deck of a ship, ink-stained fingers steadying a roll as waves slap wood, copying in cramped spaces while the captain counts ropes. Imagine a trader in a foreign market, unrolling a passage of Aristophanes in a tented courtyard, feeling the small rejoicing that comes when a line of verse is recognized and shared. Those moments, small, tactile, and persistent, are the glue that keeps intellectual traditions alive. They explain how fragments traveled, how distant communities preserved pieces of Alexandria's thinking, and why, centuries later, scholars in a different court could claim descent from Alexandrian methods and style. The shipping routes themselves tell a story of interconnected worlds. The Red Sea traffic brought spices and papyrus from the Nile's delta to ports in Arabia and India. The western routes linked Alexandria to Carthage, Rome, and the Atlantic. The mixing of languages, crafts, and knowledge on those routes made Alexandria not merely a repository but a translator, a place that rendered foreign thought into Greek idioms and vice versa. Callimachus and Eratosthenes were not isolated geniuses but participants in a cosmopolitan intellectual economy where merchant ships and diplomatic gifts were as important as academies. That cosmopolitanism is a vital part of the library's charisma and its vulnerability. It made Alexandria rich in ideas but also bound the fate of those ideas to the instability of trade and empire. There is a mythic addendum that historians rarely mention in formal articles but which colors popular imagination. The story of lost tribes of knowledge carriers, wandering groups said to have preserved fragments of Alexandrian learning across deserts and mountains. These tales claim entire families who guarded scrolls like heirlooms, reciting passages by hearthlight and hiding rolls in cave niches. The image is powerful, bordering on archetype, knowledge as oral and embodied lineage, a cultural DNA handed down in secrecy. While concrete evidence for such tribes is anecdotal, oral traditions and marginal notes in scattered manuscripts sometimes suggest non-institutional chains of transmission. Those chains underscore a vital fact: knowledge survives in uneven ways, through court libraries and through the whispered lines of a caravan storyteller. We still don't know how many of Alexandria's best treasures slipped between dock planks and into obscurity, how many were copied faithfully, and how many were misread, mistranslated, or repurposed in new hands. The sea, the market, and the pen collaborated in preservation and in loss. Together they made a history that resists singular explanation. If you close your eyes and imagine the harbor one more time, listen for the ropes creak, the gulls cry, and the faint murmur of Greek and Coptic, then imagine a single roll, damp at its edges but legible, being carried inland to a monastery or palace. The fate of that roll, whether it becomes a cornerstone of future learning or a scrap sold for kindling, depends on choices and accidents that history has not entirely recorded. We still don't know. There is a strange afterlife to loss, a kind of spectral persistence that turns absence into a new kind of presence, and nowhere is that truer than in the palimpsests, marginalia, and scattered papyri that tease us with fragments of what once was. Imagine, if you will, a monastery scriptorium centuries after Alexandria's finest minds argued under oil lamps, monks scraping down older texts from valuable parchment to reuse the skin for prayers and psalms, inadvertently preserving faint echoes of the older writing beneath. Picture the slow chemical battle between iron gall ink and time, and the painstaking labor of modern scholars with ultraviolet lamps and spectral imaging coaxing ghost letters back into legibility. Those recovered whispers, snatches of Stoic commentary, an unexpected lyric line, a technical note on botany, are like messages in bottles, sent forward across 1,000 years only to be read by readers who live in a different constellation of beliefs and languages. The modern finds at Oxyrhynchus, at Herculaneum, in the burnt libraries of monasteries, and in the damp jars found in desert sands give us a practical demonstration. Knowledge evaporates, disperses, and sometimes, against the odds, coagulates again in places that would never have been imagined by its original owners. But here's where it gets tricky: the survival of a text as a fragment can alter its meaning irreparably. A line of an argument torn from its context can be read as aphorism or as heresy. A botanical observation without its accompanying diagrams may be inscrutable, and a mathematical proof without its earlier lemmas may look like an incantation. Scholars who work to reconstruct these voices must become detectives and poets, translating both language and the partial mental world of authors long gone. To reconstruct a lost voice is to perform an act of historical ventriloquism, and that act is at once thrilling and ethically fraught. What right do we have to replace words where only ink ghosts remain? Still, for all the methodological complications, the traces recovered in palimpsests are among our most intimate contacts with Alexandrian learning, because they carry within them the very habits of marginal reading, the scribbles, the corrections, the underlinings that make ancient minds feel startlingly present. There are multiple competing theories about how much of Alexandria's corpus survives in such fragmentary afterlives and how much remains lost, irrecoverable beneath sand, sea, or unsearched archives. Some historians argue for a generous continuity. They point to the spread of Alexandrian methods through teachers and pupils, to the survival of commentarial traditions in Byzantium and the Islamic world, and to the occasional miracle find of a register or treatise that traveled across cultures. This view casts the loss as partial and transformable. Knowledge did not die so much as mutate, moving into new tongues and institutions where it took on new meanings and functions. Other scholars are more conservative. They note that our fragments are idiosyncratic survivors, heavily biased by accidents of preservation and by the interests of those who save texts. Religious institutions, for instance, preserved certain genres and ignored others. The tastes of later centuries shaped what was worth copying. If we accept that bias, then much of what the library might have contained, ephemeral treatises on local cults, technical manuals in minority languages, or the private notebooks of marginal scientists, could have been lost because no later scribe found them useful. The truth likely sits between these poles. Enough material migrated and was reworked to allow Alexandrian intellectual fingerprints to persist in subsequent traditions, but vast quantities of context, nuance, and entire genres are probably gone. That gap is not merely academic, it reshapes our understanding of how knowledge circulates, and it forces a humility about claims of continuity. There is a mythic register that overlays the scholarly debate, that of secret caches and itinerant guardians, families who memorized treatises to preserve them as living memory when physical rolls could not travel. In some cultures, the oral transmission of specialized knowledge, medical recipes, navigational lore, genealogies, remained vigorous long after literacy declined in certain regions. Imagine, for a moment, a caravan leader in the desert reciting a list of star positions that she learned as a child from a teacher who may have once been a student in Alexandria. The numbers and names might be slightly altered, folded into local cosmologies, but the core empirical observation, where the stars appear at a particular season, survives. That survival through oral lineage complicates the notion of a single repository being lost. It suggests instead that knowledge can become distributed materially and immaterially, that the absence of a central archive does not necessarily imply the end of all functional knowledge. Yet this too raises vexing questions. How much fidelity do such oral chains preserve? When practical know-how is embedded in practice rather than text, does that knowledge traceably derive from Alexandrian methods, or is it a parallel development that merely resembles them? We can debate the genealogy, but the lived fact remains: knowledge often survives in unlikely conduits. The interplay between religious change and textual survival also complicates things in ways that scholars still grapple with. When Christianity became ascendant in the Mediterranean world, institutional priorities shifted. Some pagan works found new life when they could be repurposed for allegorical Christian readings. Others were suppressed or simply neglected. The Islamic Golden Age later absorbed and translated a range of Greek texts, and Abbasid patrons in Baghdad sought out Greek manuscripts deliberately, catalyzing a transmission that would ultimately feed European renaissances centuries later. Yet, even here, the trail is uneven. Translators selected works that aligned with intellectual needs and tastes, often focusing on philosophy, medicine, and mathematics, sometimes passing over literature and historiography. The net effect is that the movement of texts across cultures is not neutral. It is directional, filtered by patronage, utility, and aesthetic preference. That filtration has been central to debates about loss. Is the library's disappearance an erasure, or is it transformation through cultural selection? But let's be fair, some of the most romantic notions about secret texts preserved through millennia are simply that, romantic. The discovery of an intact Alexandrian volume would be epical, almost miraculous, and historians know better than to place wagers on miracles. Instead, they work with slow, methodical recovery. Excavations in Oxyrhynchus unearthed tens of thousands of papyrus fragments across the late 19th and 20th centuries. Herculaneum's carbonized rolls, recovered from volcanic ash, gave us glimpses of Epicurean philosophy. Remote monasteries revealed palimpsests whose undertexts surprised researchers. Each find is a small revolution, but these revolutions are incremental and painstaking. The artifacts themselves, brittle scrolls, charred rolls, scraped parchments, require conservators, chemists, and often years of work to make legible. The temporal economy of such endeavors means that the recovery of a meaningful corpus is glacial and partial. The public's appetite for definitive treasures must often be satisfied with tantalizing partials, with single lines that illuminate but cannot reconstruct whole worlds. There is an emotional weight to this process that is easy to underestimate. When a previously lost passage is resolved, the satisfaction is complex. Joy at recovery is braided with melancholy at what remains missing, and with ethical questions about ownership and repatriation. Many of the papyri found in the first decades of modern archaeology were removed from their fine spots and ended up in European collections. That dispersal has generated debates that are as political as they are scholarly. The fate of texts is thus entangled with modern geopolitics. The colonizing impulses that powered early antiquarian collecting have left legacies that now require delicate negotiation, restitution, and collaborative scholarship with source countries. Those debates about custody and cultural patrimony mirror, in a darkly modern way, the very ancient questions that surrounded Alexandria. Who has the right to collect knowledge? Who decides what is preserved? And how should cultural heritage be shared? We still don't know how many full treatises remain waiting beneath layers of city and sea, how many meaningful fragments will surface in a future dig, or how many valuable insights are forever lost because they were never copied, read, or translated. The palimpsests and papyri are beacons, but they illuminate only narrow strands. They teach us to be patient and to cherish small recoveries while acknowledging the inevitable limits of reconstruction. If you close your eyes and imagine a faded line of verse recovered from a scraped parchment, think of it not as a single victory but as an invitation to think about memory as both fragile and resilient, about loss as a process that begets new forms of preservation, and about the human stubbornness that refuses to let knowledge vanish without a fight. We still don't know, and that not knowing is at once the wound and the promise that keeps scholars and dreamers returning to the sands and the archives, lamps in hand. If all the scenes we've walked through, the lamplit catalogues, the Serapeum's marble shadows, the harbor's rope and sail choreography, the palimpsest's ghost letters, are stitched together, a single pattern emerges. Loss and preservation are not opposites, but partners in a long, messy dance. The Library of Alexandria is both a ruin and an instruction. It teaches us that knowledge is a thing made of fragile materials and fierce intentions, papyrus and ink, yes, but also administrative will, attentive hands, and political choices about what a society values. In that sense, the loss of Alexandria is not merely the dramatic image of flames devouring scrolls. It is also the quieter, harder story of habits that slacken, patronage that dries up, catalogs left unfinished, scribes unpaid. Those small failures, repeated over decades, rearrange the fate of texts as certainly as any sack of burning timbers. Yet within that apparent devastation there are threads of continuity, marginalia that show a reader's smile, a palimpsest where a monk's prayer obscures a Greek commentary but incidentally preserves it, a merchant who copies a passage because he likes the sound of a verse. The survival of knowledge is rarely heroic in the cinematic sense, it is often accidental, quotidian, and stubborn. We still don't know the whole architecture of what was kept and what vanished. But that very not knowing sharpens our view in one useful way. It forces us to consider the mechanisms of memory, who keeps it, where it lives, and what conditions make preservation possible. There were practical choices: storage that minimized humidity, catalogs that recorded ownership and subject, scribal workshops that reproduced texts. There were also ethical choices: which voices were deemed canonical, which languages were privileged, which topics were considered dangerous. Those choices reveal as much about the societies that made them as the texts they preserved. When a ruler decided to fund a copyist, or to rescue a transcript from a ship's hold, those decisions encoded values. Conversely, when later institutions neglected a body of work, that neglect told its own story about changing priorities. The arc of Alexandria's intellectual life is therefore a lesson in cultural stewardship as much as it is a tale of spectacular loss. Another lesson is about scale and circulation. The library never existed in isolation. It was a node in a global network that linked the Western Mediterranean with the Black Sea, the Nile with the Red Sea, and Alexandria with ports as distant as Maziris and Carthage. That cosmopolitanism made the city intellectually rich and also made its collections porous. Texts flowed in and out with trade goods and diplomatic gifts. The harbor slips we imagine, rolls secreted under amphora straw, scribes copying at anchor, a crate of papyrus misfiled and sent to a new owner, are not only romantic motifs. They are plausible mechanisms that transfer knowledge between communities. Those shifting pathways mean the library's intellectual offspring are scattered across time and place, some preserved in Byzantine codices, others in Islamic translations, and others as faint echoes in oral traditions and marginal notes. Lost, therefore, becomes a relative term, Something central in one era can propagate in a dozen peripheral forms and reappear centuries later in unexpected guises. The political valence of knowledge is unavoidable. The Ptolemies built a library because knowledge conferred power, administrative, diplomatic, and symbolic. Later powers repurposed, suppressed, or neglected that same well of information according to their interests. The violence of the late antique period, the iconoclasm, the Christianizing of temples, and the turbulent politics, left scars. But so did the slow, insidious erosions of economic shifts and changing tastes. A library's endurance depends on a network of supports that are political, economic, and social. That network is fragile precisely because it is human. If we are to learn anything from Alexandria, it is that stewardship of knowledge requires persistent commitment across generations. Without it, the most valuable collections can dissolve into rumor. Yet, even as politics exerts pressure, human imagination keeps the memory alive through myth. The myths are not merely distractions, they are cultural responses to absence. Tales of secret vaults, last-minute evacuations, or wandering guardians who silently memorize treatises perform a social function. They keep the possibility of recovery alive. They also dramatize a fear. What if the most important knowledge is irretrievably gone? These myths can mislead when taken as literal reports, but they illuminate emotional truths. They tell us why people have invested so much meaning in certain objects and places, and why the loss of a library feels like a loss of a civilization's capacity to speak about itself. In that sense, the Library of Alexandria functions as a symbol for cultural fidelity. Its disappearance is a shorthand for all the ways a society can fail to transmit its most precious practices. There is also a technical, humbling truth in the palimpsests and carbonized scrolls that surface here and there. The survival of ideas often depends on material flukes. A dry, oxygen-starved environment can protect papyrus. Volcanic ash can make carbonized rolls legible in ways fire otherwise obliterates. Salt-encrusted shipwrecks can preserve goods that would have rotted ashore. The archaeology of texts is therefore often the archaeology of accidents, conditions that allowed the survival of otherwise ephemeral things. Those accidents reveal a quieter optimism. Even when institutions collapse, the material world sometimes preserves whispers of a lost world for future hands to bring back into speech. That is why modern recoveries, painstaking, slow, and technical, feel almost like miracles. Yet they are not divine interventions. They are the results of curiosity, patience, and the will to look. If the library's loss also propelled other cultures to adopt and adapt its methods, that diffusion is an important piece of the story. The Greeks' technical achievements in mathematics and geography, the medical knowledge preserved by translations in Baghdad, the commentaries copied in Byzantine centers, all show that knowledge migrates and transforms. Transmission is not mere replication, it is translation across languages and institutions that change content through interpretive choices. A Greek treatise may become an Arabic tract, which in turn shapes Latin learning. The continuity is therefore complex. It is continuity through change. Call that the survival of method rather than text. The intellectual DNA of Alexandria, its emphasis on measurement, categorization, and commentary, left traces in multiple traditions even if particular scrolls did not. That persistence matters because it shows that even partial survival can reconstitute powerful ways of thinking across centuries. We must also consider the ethical dimensions that modern scholars and institutions now face. Questions of ownership, of restitution, of collaborative scholarship that respects source communities. Many of the papyri and artifacts that illuminate Alexandria's past were removed in eras of colonial collecting and now sit in museums far from where they were found. Those collections are valuable for scholarship, but they also raise issues about access, representation, and historical justice. Our interest in resurrecting lost knowledge must therefore be tempered by a commitment to fair stewardship and to working with the communities whose heritage we study. In doing so, we honor a fundamental lesson that the ancient library embodied in practice: knowledge as a shared civic resource rather than a trophy of conquest. Emotionally, the library's story compels us because it is also, in the end, a story about human aspiration and fragility. The people who built, managed, stole, protected, and destroyed books were ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. Clerks who catalogued by candlelight, patrons who funded scholarly travel, monks who scraped parchments to serve devotional needs, soldiers who looted temple vaults, and divers who later risked their lives to recover a single fragment. Their motives were mixed: curiosity, faith, greed, duty, and that messy blend is familiar. We are their heirs in temperament. We seek patterns, we tell stories, and we both hoard and share information. That psychological continuity is perhaps the deepest thread connecting us to Alexandria. When we peer into its history, we see a mirror in which our own commitments and failings come into focus. So what does the loss of Alexandria ask of us now? It asks vigilance. It asks us to think about the forms through which knowledge is preserved: digital repositories, community libraries, diverse language transmission, and inclusive academic practices. It asks humility. The past does not surrender its secrets on command, and our reconstructions will always be partial and provisional. It asks patience. The process of recovery is often incremental and technical, requiring years of conservation and interdisciplinary effort. And perhaps above all, it asks generosity, to treat knowledge not merely as capital to be hoarded but as a commons to be tended and shared across borders and generations. The final emotional payoff is not elegiac only, it is also strangely consoling. The library's fate is not solely a cautionary tale about absence but also a testament to persistence. The fragments we recover, the palimpsest lines we decipher, and the echoes of Alexandrian method in later scholars show that human thought can be durable in unexpected ways. The library that was lost lives on, dispersed like seeds on the wind, taking root in new soils we might not have imagined. That dispersed survival reframes loss as transformation. Something ends, yes, but something else continues, mutated and perhaps even stronger in its new contexts. The moral is not that we can simply reconstruct what was lost, but that we are capable of carrying forward those best habits of care, curiosity, and communal study that made Alexandria remarkable. In the end, the mystery remains a gift. The unfinished questions, the exact number of scrolls, the full contents of the Serapeum, the routes by which particular treatises migrated, invite us into active participation rather than passive mourning. They ask us to be readers and detectives, archivists and citizens, ready to invest attention and resources where it matters. They encourage an ethic of looking, to preserve the mundane, to fund patient conservation, to respect the messy human contexts in which knowledge lives. When you think of the library, don't simply picture a monument consumed. Picture also the many small hands that kept words alive, the markets where ideas were bartered, the foreign courtyards where a line of verse was read aloud and treasured. Those are the places where continuity happens. So as we close this long conversation with the past, let the final image be neither a single inferno nor a sealed vault but a kind of covenant, that societies can choose to collect and steward knowledge or to let it dissipate, that the choices of one generation matter to the possibilities of the next, and that memory is something we build through practices, not only monuments. Keep your curiosity wide, your skepticism sharp, and your generosity steady. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.